In the words of Chris as an introduction, and we're delighted to have Chris. This is a topic titled What About All the Other Stuff? Chris says he is the husband to one woman and father to 4 daughters. He's spiritual, but not religious. He wanted to study philosophy, but ended up getting 3 degrees: fisheries science, aquatic ecology, and evolutionary biology. He worked as a tenured track professor, but quit to be a stay-at-home parent. He started Wolf Hills Brewing in Abingdon and sold it 11 years ago. He is currently investing in real estate to help his wife retire so that they might follow a dream of living on a sailboat or some other different dream. He does have a podcast called Knowledge Plus Experience Equals Wisdom. He discusses on this podcast the intersection of ecology and evolutionary biology. Spirituality and psychology are also discussed, where biology, love, and self intersect. But the happiness for that podcast for Chris is that he doesn't have to go to work. He can do that podcast from the comfort of his armchair. So Chris, we welcome you today and we look forward to your talk. Thanks for your willingness to do this. Welcome, Chris.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm always happy to talk about myself, but I'll try to put my ego to the side. And I just want to say that I really enjoyed the time that I spent with this group at Paul's invitation. I guess that was a couple of weeks ago. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. And I think I'm sort of on I'm on a quest like a lot of us, and it's really curious that on Friday, my second oldest daughter, who's a senior at Abingdon High School, was talking about Unitarian Universalists. Like they learned about that on Friday, which is pretty neat. I mean, it's all pretty new to me, but my feeling is that it's a really neat place, and I appreciate you guys doing this and sort of being a part of this group. And it's neat to get to be a small part of it. And who knows what the future may hold. I wish I could get my screen to show something besides just a name, but I guess I'll just look at the camera. So yeah, thanks for the introduction. And even though I wrote it myself, I was a scientist, right? I always wanted to be a philosopher, but I became a scientist. And I don't know if you're familiar with this idea that, nobody can talk about your mom but you, or if you've ever lived, you can't make fun of West Virginia unless you've lived in West Virginia. I don't know what any of that means, except to say that I feel like I have some authority as a scientist because I spent, 15 years of my life doing it. And what I find myself, I feel like from that, I have 2 goals and 2 missions that result from my responsibility to that community. And one is to help people learn about what science really is, because I don't think we know. I don't think most people don't really know what science is. We have an idea of what it is, but we don't really understand it. I didn't. I mean, my whole experience with learning science was that it was not at all what I thought it was. And I don't think that's too uncommon. And then secondarily, to talk about the limitations of science and the idea that it has become this dogmatic entity that's not at all what it was supposed to be. Science is a tool. It's not a religion. But especially in terms of a couple of things you guys mentioned already, climate change, the idea that it's 43 in California and these freak tornadoes that just happened, science is important. And then the coronavirus, what I see in both of those issues is a whole lot of misuse of science, both by scientists and non-scientists. For what that's worth. But before I get into that, and I'll try to be really brief, my idea is to talk briefly so that we can actually talk more, to have a discourse. The couple other things that I do just about me are that I'm obsessed with mandolins. So I appreciate the musical element too. I mean, I love the instrument and I play the instrument. And then also my spiritual journey has landed me on something that's very, it's sort of at the bridge of science and this other stuff, this that I'm referring to in the title of my talk, which is called internal family systems. And I imagine none of you are familiar with this because it's just not that popular, but it's a psychological model that describes that's used for healing, that sort of describes the self as or a human being as an amalgamation of parts. And so you might hear some of that talk if I mention IFS or something. Just know that it's a psychological school of thought that is part of my journey, and it is a good metaphor for the science thing. So the first thing, I'll try to be as brief as I can, and feel free to interrupt. I can see some of you, but just, I don't mind being interrupted. I taught 18-year-old kids for 10 years. He's sort of used to it. Is what science is and what science can and can't do. And briefly, science is just a way of answering questions. It's a method. It's an approach. It's a set of standardized rules that, a handful of people made up that said, this is a really good way of going about answering a question that other people will understand. Let's all use a standard method. Instead of all separately gazing at our navels in this pasture or under this apple tree, let's come up with a set of tools that will all sort of follow, so that if you come to me and say, the sky is blue because of the refraction of light, I'll understand that you followed this same method, and I can sort of get how you came to this conclusion. And if you think about it like that, it's almost like just like a language, right? You don't have to speak English to get your point across or to understand people. And so it starts with that question, right? If science is a tool for answering questions, it begins with, why is the sky blue? Who am I? Why am I here? Why does insurance cost so much? Whatever it is. And that's the main thing we always kind of forget, right? Is that it's just a question. And then next is, you probably remember this hypothesis idea, right? You always hear, and the most common thing students would say is, a hypothesis is an educated guess. And that's kind of right. But the thing that makes a hypothesis unique is that it implies math. We take our question and we put it in terms of a hypothesis so that we can do math. And the only reason I say that is to say, and to be as brief as possible, science takes the world of infinite complexity and dumbs it down to a set of numbers. And then we take those numbers, we put them into math, like statistics or an algorithm or a model, and that math produces some results. And we like math because we trust numbers. Numbers don't lie. Math is neat. It's a neat way of understanding the world that's fairly precise. And then so we've turned this complicated world of words and emotions and nature and things we don't understand into this set of numbers. And now our job is to convert those numbers back into our question. And if you think about that, there's a whole lot of ambiguity in there, right? And scientists aren't gods. And again, sort of my bigger point is that this is a really coarse tool. And there's a whole lot of room. A lot of people say science reduces bias, right? It takes our opinions and ideas out of the equation. And I will argue that there's so much room for bias in the scientific method. It minimizes it, but it's still chock full of it. And so the end result of that numerical analysis is evidence. And one thing I'll add here that's sort of my soapbox is, we rarely ever prove anything. It despises me it really bothers me when people say there's proof. I hate that word. I just don't think it exists. It's kind of like truth. Proof is a weird thing, and maybe that's something we could talk about. What we get is evidence. And if you do an experiment, I like to look at this as like a conveyor belt, where you're putting a pebble of scientific evidence on this conveyor belt that's sort of going up a hill. And then that pebble falls off into like a pile. And if you do one experiment, you put one pebble on it, there's one pebble in the pile. If that pile gets bigger and bigger, eventually we look at it and we go, okay, maybe there's something to this. All these pebbles are falling on this same pile. And eventually, and this is the point where I get a whole lot of pushback from the scientific community, we as a society collectively look at that pile and determine whether or not that evidence is meaningful or not. So that's incredibly subjective and biased. So that what I'm saying is the end result of science, to close the loop, to answer the question, is up to us. It's not up to the scientific researcher. All they've done is done the study, and they've produced the pebble of evidence. And then their job is to stand, well, the real job is to communicate that to the world, which scientists are terrible at doing. But their job then is to quit and do it again. It's our job to go to the evidence and sort of decide whether or not this is a meaningful thing for our world, which again is a great area of discussion, because that means a lot of different things, right? That we could look at this giant pile of evidence and we could collectively go, nah, that doesn't mean anything. I don't believe it. I'm not into it. I'm not going to listen to it, which I kind of think is maybe where we are now. And then, so that's kind of in a nutshell. I could talk about that literally for hours. And I swear I'm trying to be brief. The second thing is that, if when you have a hammer, everything's a nail, right? You're familiar with that phrase. Well, science has become the hammer, and the world is only nails. And what I love about spirituality, or even psychology, which a lot of scientists say isn't a real science because you can't measure people, right? You can't convert a person into numbers. And so psychology relies on a lot of other sort of non-statistical analytic tools. And a lot of hardcore scientists say that's not even real. Ecology, the field that I come from, there's only one Earth. And so if you want to study Earth, one of the tenets of science is you got to replicate it. You got to run the experiment thousands of times. Well, you can't with it one Earth. Anyway, so there's these sort of soft scientists, but I don't see a lot. So a lot of questions that long way to go to this point in my life that I want to answer, science is no good for. Science is no good for what is the meaning of life? Why am I here? What kind of a husband do I want to be? Science is not a tool. It's a terrible tool for answering some of those questions. But what we're doing is we've given the scientists either all the power or none of the power, depending on where you fall. And we're trying to use science to answer. And so I wonder, this is like toward the other stuff. I think originally things like theology and religion and spirituality, indigenous belief systems, stories, we had all these other tools in our toolbox to help us answer the questions of, well, heck, science has only been around for a few hundred years. What did we do before that? Were we like running around naked in fields, like dying of, we figured we knew how to live. We had other tools. And so not that I'm on a mission to do this, but I really wish we taught science better, that it was in a better context, that we didn't allow it to become something more than it is or less than it is, and that we appreciated the existence of other tools. And I was just doing an interview for my podcast with an IFS psychologist researcher who suggested that, at one time, religions probably did a lot as a tool to help people answer some of these unscientific questions. Whether they do anymore is a matter of debate. And so I think these tools have existed, but for some reason, we've shifted away from a world that has any other tool to answer a question besides science. And that's, in the least, it's absurd because that's not what science was supposed to do. Right. And it's not the tool for that. And so that sort of leaves me with like, well, what are these other questions? And I've mentioned a couple of them before, things like, why am I here? What is God? What is self? That's the interesting thing about IFS. IFS talks a lot about self. And as a concept, that's just something that we haven't been really good at answering. And then sort of just the general question to the group of, aren't there a lot of other questions out there that whose answers have been elusive using science to answer them? So what other ways? And so for me, I guess an example of this would be, I did about 10 years of therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy. Many of you are probably familiar with this. It's sort of a talk therapy where there's a set of tenets of sort of the correct way to deal with your thoughts. And then generally people have old beliefs or thought systems that we've developed over time that create problems for us. And all you're supposed to do is replace this correct thought with this incorrect one that you have, as if it were that easy. And so I spent 10 years doing that kind of therapy, and I understood it analytically. And analytically, I was a trained scientist at that time. I could interpret what the words mean. I understand what you're saying. I should be more confident, but I'm not, or whatever it is, or I should not think that people aren't going to love me or whatever it is, but I still feel that way. And so there was a lot of shame and frustration with not being able to change myself, even though I had the rule book in front of me and understood it. And then when I discovered this IFS, which does not deal in analysis, it deals with your internal world. I don't really know how to describe it, except it's more of you get into a meditative state, and you
Chris, tell us what IFS is.
Oh, I'm sorry.
IFS.
Yeah, so IFS is internal family systems. And it's a model created by a guy named Dick Schwartz about 20, 30 years ago as a part of his PhD dissertation in psychology. And he developed it because this is what he was seeing in his patients. He was seeing while he was training, he would see patients, and they would tell him that they had a part of them who was a scared child, or they had a part of them that felt like they really just wanted to lash out, or they had a part of them. And so he started to listen to people and say, well, let's deal with these parts individually. And then he saw a model where these parts inside of people were like a family that didn't know that each other existed, but they came from the same person. And so he thought, I wonder if I can get these parts to talk to each other and sort of share what they know about each other. Because a lot of them were like a 6-year-old, were stuck in 6 years old or 12 years old when something traumatic happened to them. And he realized that he could actually help people heal some of these things that they had been unable to heal before. And now there's on the order of several thousand practitioners of IFS who have been certified, trained to treat patients. And they estimate over 100,000 patients who have been treated, and the overwhelming body of evidence suggests that this tool works. We don't understand how it works, and it happens. The point I was making is it happens from your body. For me, it worked because I had to learn to shut off the analytical mind. I had to throw science out the window, and really, it took me a year to figure this, to train myself to do this. And the best thing I can say that it's like is meditation, where you just sort of try to quiet your mind and pay attention to your body. And that unscience has done more for me in less than a year than I learned in 10 years of therapy. So all that to say, I have found evidence in this unscience world that it can be helpful.